Welcome to PovPolPodcast, where we discuss a variety of current events and issues locally, provincially, nationally, and abroad about poverty or from a poverty lens. PovPolPodcast is proudly produced in Calgary, Alberta, on Treaty 7 land, and we acknowledge the land, traditions, history, and the people of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit neighbors who reside here. In our first segment today, we're going to talk about quality of life programs and homelessness. And to some extent, we're also going to touch on this with poverty as well. But mostly we're going to be focusing on homelessness because that's where there is a huge lack of quality of life programs. Now, as I've already said in the previous episode of my podcast, I was homeless for a number of years. And the shelter I was staying at offered tons of quality of life programs designed to enhance the dignity and humanity of the person who is staying at the shelter. And there are also a lot of other homeless related services that also fail to address some of these issues. It's not just limited to those operating in the shelter. It just seems like no one really cares about making sure that people who are homeless still have some degree of quality of life supports. And when I talk about quality of life supports, I'm not just talking about the basic, let's just make sure that, they're fed and they have a mat. I'm talking about things that help the homeless community actually feel like a community, feel empowered, and additionally have some kind of mental health activity. Anyways, this particular shelter used to have several programs. This included an art program, and this art program had all sorts of branches to it. It had painting, and they would provide all of the materials. And that included brushes, canvases, paints. It was all provided so long as you cleaned up after yourself after you used the space. They also had a kiln if you wanted to do pottery. It had tools for engraving. And there's also a bit of a business aspect to it as well. While they didn't go out of their way to teach entrepreneurship, for example, they would allow people to put their artwork on display where visitors and donors and board members could see them and to offer them for a price. So their recommendation was $10 for every hour you worked on the piece. And that actually wasn't too bad of a deal then, considering that was well above minimum wage. Minimum wage was, I believe, $7.90 at that time. So you're actually getting an above minimum wage deal for that. The downside is that the shelter would take these pieces and they would take a 10% gallery fee, which I think was fair. They would only take that gallery fee, though, if you were selling the artwork. If you weren't selling the artwork, there was no fee to just put it up for people to view, which was nice. They also had leather working. If you wanted to make leather-bound journals or books, you could do that. I actually had a friend who's actually working on making some chainmail in this program. And they also had music instructors come in if you wanted to learn a musical instrument, particularly guitar and piano. They also had a theater program. And the theater program started off as an improv team, and then we were getting bookings, and then we were getting paid to actually do performances because we were getting bookings. So there was that business side to it. And then eventually we moved on from just being an improv troupe to putting on productions with verb theater and downstage theater and making connections. I got to take a creative writing class under Eugene Stickland. Now, for those of you who don't know, I actually went to college to study theater arts. I dropped out of college partially because I did not do too good in my non-theater classes, but also because it was a Bible college. And while I was relatively religious at that time, I was still a progressive, so I didn't really fit in with a lot of the students and faculty there. And additionally, I saw that a lot of the students who were graduating were getting volunteer positions at churches, and I did not want to flush a whole bunch of student loan money down the drain in order to not get paid. So I dropped out, but because I had some of that training, I was able to get that foothold in the theater industry through these programs that the shelter was offering. And I got to take that creative writing class under Eugene Stickland, who's a hero to me. He's someone that I've idolized and looked up to, and someone whose writing I had admired. And I would strongly recommend you go out and purchase a copy of his play, Some Assembly Required. It's a wonderful Christmas story, bit of a black comedy, but it's like a Christmas play for modern times. Dysfunctional families, characters we can relate to. Back to the case at point, though, I was able to build a lot of connections, and even after that program closed, I was still able to maintain some of those connections. I was able to do some work later on with Downstage Theater on a program called Bottle Pickers Monologues. So this program was not a waste of time. And this program was not only good for my mental health, but good for the mental health of those who participated in it. It helped us build relationships. It helped us learn to form a community. And that program no longer exists. Yet the volunteers who were running the art program felt the program was so important that for a while, and I'm not even sure if they're still doing this, but for a while, they were actually running the program out of a garage after the shelter cut funding towards the program. Now, the reason why the shelter cut funding towards the program is because there's no money in encouraging arts. People want something with tangible numbers that you can see, and that's what donors want. And so those tangible numbers are how many people got jobs, how many people got homes. Those are the measurables. And so without those measurables, there was a change in focus in the direction that the shelter wanted to go. Other quality of life programs that were cut were education-based. At the same time they closed the art program, they also closed down the education program. And there were other things in the education program that many people were involved in who were left in the lurch. There was basic computer skills programs. And when I say basic, I mean these were designed for people who did not know how to open an internet browser, how to create an email address. Is basically if you knew how to turn a computer on but nothing else, this was a program for you. And those are actually important employment related because you're going to need those skills to write a resume. You're going to need those skills to apply for jobs. There was also a public speaking program, and it was tied to Toastmasters, though it wasn't a Toastmasters itself. It was rather sponsored by Toastmasters. And as a part of that, we also had a bit of a debate club. And this allowed us to learn how to resolve conflict, how to use evidence-based approaches to resolve disputes. And it allowed us to realize that conflict isn't always a bad thing, that you can be civil. But public speaking is also important when it comes to building up confidence. any job you want, you're going to want to be a confident speaker. Even say a job interview. How are you going to walk into a job interview without having those speaking skills, without being able to represent yourself, without being able to advocate yourself? So these are programs that are still important, but they also are important for a quality of life because they give someone a sense of self-worth. They're important for mental health. They're important for allowing us to feel like we deserve better. It's said that when someone comes out of homelessness and into housing, they go through the revolving door 7 times before they become permanently housed. That's an average, and I'm not sure where that statistic actually comes from, but that's a phrase that's been bandied about among workers for a number of years. And part of that might be that that person doesn't feel confident in there, that that person doesn't feel like they belong in housing. People need a sense of belonging. They need a sense of community, and they don't necessarily have to feel like they belong in a shelter, but they should feel like they belong somewhere. Especially if we're trying to tell communities that they need to allow affordable housing projects in, we need to make sure that people who are coming out of homelessness have that sense of community, that they know what it feels like to belong in a community. Now, most programs geared towards those who are homeless center around one of 3 areas, and that is employment, that is housing, and at religious institutions, Bible studies. That's really about it. And I'm going to talk about what my favorite program was at any of these organizations. We had something called Philosophy Cafe. It was a dialectic discussion. And I am a lover of philosophy. I could list off some of my favorite philosophers. Everything from Socrates, not Plato. And we can also debate the historical authenticity of Socrates. But we were discussing a lot of contemporary philosophy and a lot of economics. And there's about 10 to 15 of us. We'd sit down for breakfast on weekends, and we would have a philosophical discussion. And it was purely discussion based. Sometimes there would be a bit of a leader or a facilitator, but the idea was to basically be philosophers. And you don't need that university education to be a philosopher. You just need to know how the dialectic works and how to hold dialogues in large groups. And so we had discussed everything from evolution from a philosophy point. We had chapters and meetings on Richard Dawkins. We had discussed Adam Smith versus Marx in terms of capitalism and communism. We had discussed Chomsky. I'm a huge fan of Noam Chomsky. And we also discussed racial and religious discrimination. And we were a community. We were a wonderful community. And it even spread to outside of these things, because then we'd start meeting for breakfast in the shelters. And those of us who were part of this philosophy cafe would then be sitting in the shelters, and we'd have our breakfast at the shelter on a weekday. And we would start discussing what is the nature of time, and is time real? The Church of 5 minutes ago, if you will, and other topics. And it was wonderful because we got to show that we were smart, that we could have civil discussions, and we had that sense of self-worth and community. And we translate these skills into the real world. And some of the outcomes that this had is I was able to work with Downstage Theatre thanks to my partnership with the Bottle Pickers Association of Calgary and Calgary Can, and we partnered with Downstage to put on a production called Bottle Picker Monologues, a theatrical presentation telling the stories of bottle pickers in a variety of monologue-style formats. This included everything from a question and answer period between one of the downstage hands and a bottle picker, to one-man shows about 10 minutes long that had actually no dialogue and were all physically performed on the stage through action, to a 5-minute segment that I wrote designed to sound like a radio play. But the idea is that this was a production created by members of the bottle picking community to tell the story of bottle picking community. Other outcomes have been, since a few of us have become housed since then, I was able to apply for and won a grant in a competition where residents of the neighborhood that I was living in got to vote on who got the funding. And I won this grant to hold a Yes in My Backyard barbecue to thank the community that I live in for being so open to low-income housing. Home Space Society has several buildings in our neighborhood. Calgary Housing has several buildings in our neighborhood. There's an addictions treatment center in our neighborhood. And yet, a block away from where I live, there's multi-million-dollar riverside homes. We have been a very blended neighborhood, and I wanted to do something to thank the community for being such gracious hosts to those of us who are living in poverty. And because I had a sense of community, I was able to fight to get this grant, got awarded it, and do something wonderful for the neighborhood because I know what community means. Another friend of mine in another neighborhood was actually nominated for Neighbor of the Year. He also ended up winning Volunteer of the Year from the Calgary Homeless Foundation. Someone else who lives in the south end of town started a big lunch program for students in the neighborhood. And so when you work on quality of life programs, you're not only enhancing the mental health of those who are living on the streets, you are setting them up to be contributing members to the communities that they are going to move into when they segue off the streets. You are filling them with a sense of accountability and responsibility to the neighborhoods that they are living in, which means that they are going to do the things that they need to do to stay housed. It's like, I can't speak about jail, but I've always lived with a philosophy. If you treat someone like a monster for however long that they're in prison, how do you expect to release anything back into society besides a monster? We've redirected our systems and services so that they are essentially punishing people for being homeless. And how do we expect to put responsible citizens into the community under that idea? We're saying, oh, you don't have a job, you don't have a home, so we're going to make sure that you feel like garbage while you're living here. And that might not be intentional, but that is definitely a byproduct of taking away these quality of life programs and focusing it entirely on those two areas. And I don't want to say that housing and employment aren't important. They absolutely are. They are so important. But we need to ensure that people who are living in homelessness have that sense of belonging, that they know what it's like to be part of a community, that they don't feel like a monster, that they don't feel like they're a failure just for being homeless. And so we have to bring back some of these quality of life programs and enhance the lives of those who are experiencing homelessness, so that they know that, yes, you are on the streets right now, but you still matter. We've got to stop using our systems to punish people for being homeless. I like to believe that for 90% of cases, homelessness is not a choice. And even if it is, basic capitalist theory, the first couple of pages in any economics textbook will tell you that people make the choices that are in their best self-interest. So if homelessness is a choice in their best interest, what were the other choices? They must have been pretty bad, and that is a failure on society. So even when someone does choose homelessness, that is a failure on society to address a missing need. And even if people make the wrong choices, that choice should not become a life sentence. We should not be continually punishing people for those choices. We have to give them the opportunities to succeed, and these quality of life programs will do that. We need to restore them. We need to enhance them. We need to support them, and we need to fund them. Otherwise, we are going to continue to see this cycle of a revolving door in and out of the streets, because we have failed to actually put valid members of community into communities, because we have failed to create members of community. Our next topic today is going to be on hostile design. And hostile design is a pretty broad term, so I want to focus specifically in terms of hostile design relating to homelessness. And the reason why this is such a big issue is because we see hostile design everywhere. Skateboarders actually deal with it all the time. A lot of areas are specifically designed to prevent people with skateboards from being able to use those areas. Now, on benches, that makes sense. And on certain ledges, like plant ledges in buildings, that absolutely makes sense, where you have like a bit of a retaining wall with plants in there. But there are side effects to it. Obviously, especially with benches, they've also designed benches to keep people who are homeless from sleeping on them. And obstacles have been put on sidewalks to try and keep skateboarders from using them, but they also keep people with disabilities from being able to get by on these sidewalks. So let's take a deeper delve into hostile design and how it relates to the homeless community. Additionally, I should make it known that y'all know I'm a bit of an anarchist, so if you're a skateboard and you can tear it up somewhere, I ain't here to tell you not to. Anyways, hostile design and homelessness. This has been an ongoing issue for a number of years, and Toronto has actually started mapping instances of hostile design in its city, in the greater Toronto area. And I'm actually have started a map. I still need to get more places put on it and user feedback on it, but you can see a few places I've got marked out on my website, and I will be adding more as I come across them. But the whole point of hostile design and homelessness is to make sure that people who are homeless are not visible there. It was a huge item in the news a couple of years ago when the Calgary Public Library had put up what it called fins across its alcove to prevent people who are homeless from sleeping in the alcoves of the downtown Calgary Public Library at its old location. This cost, I believe, $80,000 to install, and it was only there for about a year because the library eventually moved to its new location, and when the University of Calgary moved in there, they took it down. And kudos to the University of Calgary for doing that, by the way. But hostile design and combating hostile design has actually been an important part of almost all of the activism that I do. When I was working with the Calgary Homeless Foundation and the City of Calgary to set up a permanent memorial for homeless people who passed away, it was important to us that any benches that were near the memorial were designs that people could lay down on them. No armrests on the bench. And that's because we felt that if we're setting up a memorial and the idea is that we want people who are homeless to go there and reflect, it would be really stupid to then design the entire thing so that homeless people are then shuffled along minutes later, or they can't sit there or lay there comfortably. It's supposed to be a place of peace and refuge for members of the homeless community. Now, I get it. Not every place is supposed to be a place of peace and refuge for the homeless community. But when you don't have a home to go to, you have to look for these places wherever you can. So designing benches, for example, with the armrests on them, and they're not even armrests because they're literally only about 3 inches high. No one is going to be using that as an armrest. You're going to want at least 10 inches for something to be a suitable armrest. No one is sitting on a bench and leaning over to the point that they're going to cause severe spine damage to make sure that they get their arm on that rest. And if my audio levels change, it's because I'm actually making movements while I am recording this, and I am mimicking the position and posture that someone would have to sit in order to actually use one of these as an armrest. But it's not just armrests on benches. Architects actually take classes, and artists actually take classes on trying to design pieces in order to make sure that undesirables, air quotes, before and after undesirables, loiter around and don't loiter around in these areas. A good example is Center Street Station train platform. There are some grates along the platform, and every now and then, not all the time, but every now and then, the vents go off and those grates actually give out quite a bit of heat. It's not like an intentional effort to warm the C-train station platform. However, what it is instead is just a vent that expels recycled air from the building. And as a side effect of that, it would give out warm air usually. So there are a lot of people who are homeless who would sleep on those grates. I spent many nights sleeping on those grates. And so the city, in its infinite wisdom, decided to beautify the C-train station by putting art displays on those grates in order to obstruct people from sleeping on them comfortably. That is hostile design. That is a way of saying you are not supposed to be here. The term that I've often used for hostile design, it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek term and it's a bit complex, but I've always called it relocation of the population through urban design. If you want to use it in terms of business lingo or political lingo, that is what they're doing, is they are trying to design their communities to keep certain people out. And this ties a little bit into NIMBY, which we actually touched on in our first segment earlier. And the danger to this is, tying back to our first segment, is we are treating people who are homeless like monsters. We are saying, you cannot be here, at a time where we are passing laws to try and make places more accessible towards racialized communities, towards members of the indigenous, towards people with disabilities. Instead, we are also passing laws and policies and designing all of our buildings to be as unwelcoming as we can to members of the homeless community. And it goes just beyond public works and sculptures, although that is a huge part of it. Another example is lockable ashtrays. We know that there are members of the homeless community who have a cigarette addiction, and if they can't afford cigarettes, they are going to go to ashtrays and pick cigarette butts out of them. And I certainly hope I'm not giving anybody ideas, because we already have these ashtrays all over the place. But creating ashtrays that lock up so that people can't get to the butts in them is another form of hostile design. It's a way of saying, we don't want to see you here, even though you're not breaking any law. Your mere existence just makes people uncomfortable. And there's a psychological reason for that. If you're uncomfortable around a homeless person, it's because you recognize something is wrong. It's not because that homeless person is actually dangerous. It's because you recognize that there is something wrong with a society that allows homeless people to exist. And so our often instinctual reaction is to try and sweep it under the rug. And the city of Calgary has been sweeping homelessness under the rug for years. We have actively passed laws specifically targeting the homeless community to the exclusion of all others. Now, these laws don't explicitly say homeless person on them, but the old Anatole France quote, "The law, in its majestic equality, will punish a rich man for sleeping under a bridge as much as it punishes the poor." First of all, it won't. A guy with a briefcase and a very, very nice Armani suit and all that stuff, if he doesn't get mugged, he is definitely going to be left alone by the police officers. He'd have to have a pretty ratty blanket to have the police officers wake him up aggressively, like they used to do to me all the time. And then once they find out he's a pretty rich person, yeah, that any tickets he gets, those are going to be tossed out before he even sees a JP. Back to the topic at hand, though, of hostile design. A lot of it is also about how we design our interior of buildings. Let's go back to the downtown Calgary Public Library. The popular hotspot for the homeless community to hang out at was on the main floor. Sometimes they would be just using their laptops on the main floor, either near the coffee shop if they wanted to log into the coffee's Wi-Fi, or if they're logging into the public library's Wi-Fi. They could be anywhere on the main floor, but the point is they were all hanging out on the main floor. And not just in individuals, they were in groups. The main floor was kind of a social hub, so the whole "shh, be quiet, this is a library" expectations were usually different on the main floor. That's where the graphic novels were, that's where the chessboard was, and the board games were. So that's where a lot of people hung out, and because they could socialize there, they could chat there. And what did they start doing? First, they removed chairs from all but a handful of tables. Then they removed chairs from the rest of the tables. And then they got rid of any tables that were waist high for people to sit at. They only kept the pub tables, the standing tables for people to stand at. This was a way of trying to, if not push the homeless community out of the library, it was there to try and at least push them up to higher floors where they would be less visible. And it worked. Most of the people began moving to the third floor. They would only go to the first floor if they were looking for a game of chess. And by the way, street people, are damn good at chess. If you want a good chess game, go and watch a chess game between two people who are on the streets. They will take their time with their moves and try and select the best possible moves, and it can get pretty intense sometimes. But the whole purpose of this was to make sure that people who were homeless were not visible. I had an argument with the executive director of the library at the time. I did actually later apologize to him. Well, my views haven't changed. I do realize that I was really aggressive and on edge and temperamental in this debate. And losing the debate class that I was part of in the previous segment might have had something to do with that. Might not. Ultimately, I am responsible for my own actions, but I haven't been able to keep fine-tuned with my conflict resolution skills. Anyways, I did eventually apologize to him a couple years later, but I still stand by the view that the library system was designing itself to be excluding to members of the homeless community. And in our argument, one of the things he had stated was, oh, well, we hear all the time that we're a great place and that we're better than the DI. Congratulations. You are better than the lowest possible bar. Do you want an applause for that? I'm not sure if the microphone's picking it up, but there was some sarcastic clapping there. And this is an ongoing issue. And I actually had the opportunity to spend some days with Mike Morrison, the local blogger. Many of you know him. You should follow him on Twitter, follow him on Facebook, Mike's Bloggity. And I was able to take him around and show him all of these examples of hostile design, including the one at the Center Street platform, including the one at the library, including benches that people could not sit down on or lay down on. And I even showed him, I think, on Stephen Avenue, there were some benches that were very uncomfortable to sit on because they were sloped at such an angle in order to prevent people from sleeping on them. They wanted to be like, if you sleep on this, you will roll off of it, because the benches were at a slope. And it was a very uncomfortable slope to even sit on. You're actually using a lot of legwork to try and stay on them. Defeats the whole purpose of a bench, if you ask me. So when we design our city to exclude homeless people, just like that bench, we're suddenly neglecting the needs of non-homeless people as well. This is something that impacts everyone. And one other example of hostile design that I want to quickly touch on before we end this particular topic is, this is more of a private property thing and not a taxpayer-funded thing. And private property is different. I still don't like hostile design on private property. And there are avenues to deal with that, but that is something that is largely out of the taxpayers' hands. If you remember at Kensington Safeway, they had set up a whole bunch of foams to prevent people who are homeless from sitting on the half walls in its courtyard, is spikes. Now, we don't see the metal pigeon spikes in Calgary very often. I haven't actually seen the metal ones that you often see in London. But I have, however, seen little pyramids on certain parts of buildings. Tiny, jagged little pyramids that are designed to just fill up space to make it uncomfortable for people to lay down on. And that is, again, problematic. That is almost an insult. It's a way of saying, if you choose to lay here, you are going to get injured. And then that's why you start seeing people walking around with 10 or 11 blankets, because modern problems require modern solutions. And it's not just about the homeless community as well. There are buildings that give off a bit of a weird pitch noise through speakers, and they're piped in, and it's done at a frequency that adults can't hear, but youth can, and it causes migraines in youth. It is literally, it's designed to be a gang deterrent, as if gang members were all kids and all kids were just parts of gangs, but it is a way of saying, we are going to cause you physical discomfort just for existing. This city has learned a lot about hostile design. These businesses have learned a lot about hostile design, and they are utilizing it. They are utilizing it to hurt people. And it is discrimination based on class or social position, which currently there's no constitutional or charter protection based on it. But it is a problem, and it is another way that we reinforce and encourage discrimination and human rights abuses against the homeless community. And it needs to stop, because if we are going to be a society that starts claiming that we're woke, oh my god, I'm 36 years old and I just said woke. Starting to get the boomer in me coming out. Then we need to start realizing that we can't be picky about that. We need to create a safer, better world for everyone. We need to end hostile design. We need to start pressuring local schools that teach architecture or drafting or building to not teach these classes anymore. And we need to start encouraging artists to not take jobs that have hostile design impact. And I don't want to tell an artist to not make money. I'm an artist myself. I don't make very much money. I get it. But we as a community need to start keeping these things in our mind, because we can do something about it. We can have it implemented as part of municipal policy that they will no longer do hostile design projects. We can encourage artists to no longer take on projects that might be hostile design. Teach artists to recognize hostile design projects and hopefully work with them and encourage them to say no to taking on such projects. And again, get into the schools, get into the colleges, get into the artist programs, and get them to stop teaching artists how to do it. It needs to be completely removed from the urban design conversation altogether. If we want to build a vibrant community, we cannot have any part of it that says, no, you are not allowed here. Because while we're trying to build a neighborhood and we're trying to build buildings and we're passing laws that say that people who are black, that people who are indigenous, that people with disabilities can come in here, and then we're also passing laws saying your building has to be designed to be welcoming to these individuals, and then we turn around and we pass laws saying that, but this group of people cannot come in here, and we're going to pass laws saying that this group of people cannot be here, here, or here, and we're going to start designing our buildings to discourage these individuals from being here, here, or here, then we've really lost our way. Let's get back on track. Okay, finally, today we are going to move into our lightning round segment. This is going to be a short lightning round. We've only got 4 topics this time around, and I've been spending the past little while trying to do sound balancing, so Hopefully we get better quality audio now than we did in the previous segments. So first off, romanticizing homelessness. There have been a lot of issues where we've tried to romanticize homelessness, make it look like it was not as bad as it was, or tried to make it look like it was some kind of symbol of freedom and liberation, and try and make it sound like it's appealing to people, which only reinforces the idea that homelessness is a choice and that people want to choose homelessness because it's a life of no responsibilities, when that is something that couldn't be further from the truth. Examples in history of efforts to romanticize homelessness include the old boxcar clowns that you often see in artwork, with the guys in the clown makeup and their bindle sticks, as they're called, the little sticks that have little satchels on them. And as well, there is also Fred Skelton and his character Freddy the Freeloader, and even songs such as King of the Road. And while those are all things that were created a long time ago, those are still things that we see brought up a lot nowadays. You'd be surprised how many people still love to talk about the song King of the Road or sing the song King of the Road, and it helps reinforce ideas of homelessness that aren't true. And as long as we keep holding on to this romantic idea of homelessness, it's going to be much harder for us to provide services to the people who are homeless and in need. Next up on our lightning round segment, poverty and decriminalization. There's been a lot of efforts to talk about how we should handle poverty. Are police officers the best way to handle poverty? So far, we still have a list of bylaws in Calgary that specifically target the homeless community to the exclusion of others. And efforts to decriminalize homelessness have surrounded more around the penal system aspect. So if someone who's homeless has been given a whole bunch of fines for being homeless, it used to be that they would either be appointed community service, which they would often perform at shelters or services that they utilize, or they could have the pay or stay option, where they go into remand for a couple of nights until their fines have been paid off. And that is costly on the justice system, because you're paying about $2,000 a night for someone to pay off a fine at a value of about $75 to $100 a night towards their fines. And that adds up. And so the solution that the NDP government had come up with when they were in power was, oh, we're no longer going to put people in jail for bylaw infractions. Instead, we're going to garnish their wages and make it impossible for them to get a driver's license until those fines have been paid. And essentially what that is you're trying to draw blood from a stone. And this isn't just a homelessness issue. I know I mentioned homelessness earlier in the segment, but it is a poverty issue, because you have people in poverty who might not be able to afford transit on that particular day. And so it is a broad poverty issue, as the law tends to be geared against people who are in poverty. And so the solution was, instead of getting rid of these laws that specifically punish people for being poor or punish people for being homeless, we're going to be like, no, we're going to keep those laws, and now we're going to find a way to punish them even more, because now they can't defer their payments, and we're going to draw blood from a stone. And that does not actually decriminalize poverty. That enhances the criminalization of poverty and reinforces the criminalization of poverty. What needs to happen is these laws that target people who are in poverty and target people who are homeless to the exclusion of others need to be eliminated. Get rid of the laws, and that's how you decriminalize poverty. Additionally, we can defund the police and start teaching people that there are some things that you need a social worker for, and we need emergency social workers and emergency housing locators and emergency service providers to come and meet people where they're at instead of the police. Next up, 5th anniversary of the Homeless Charter of Rights. This is just a quick one here. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, I was one of the researchers for the Homeless Charter of Rights through the Calgary Homeless Foundation. And this past week, we celebrated the 5th anniversary of our launch of that charter. And so I just want to take a moment to say happy birthday, Homeless Charter of Rights. Hopefully we can move forward with ways to enforce it and to get more organizations on board and eventually make that political change that we were talking about in poverty and decriminalization, about amending legislature to recognize homelessness as an oppressed minority group and to have protections under the Alberta Human Rights Act, and to eliminate laws that target the homeless community specifically. Lastly, we want to talk about ending pandemic pay for essential workers. Earlier this week, Loblaws has announced that they are going to be ending their pandemic pay for essential workers, a $2 an hour bonus for being a frontline worker during the pandemic crisis and the current health crisis. And I got to get out of the habit of mentioning the actual name, because when you mention the name of the illness, we all know what we're talking about. Mexican beer virus. Note, not affiliated with Mexican beer, and please do support this Mexican beer brand. They have absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic. And the pandemic's not done yet. Numbers are going down. That's great. Other organizations, I mentioned Loblaws earlier, but they're not the only one, and they certainly were not the first to eliminate it. We need to, I believe, either continue with that pandemic pay or make sure that there is a plan in place that should a second wave of the pandemic occur, that it is quick and easy to implement and bring that back in. Ideally, I would like to see pandemic pay continue until we have a guarantee that workers are not going to get it, or until there is such a period of time that no frontline workers have contracted this virus. And that also means incentives to make sure that your employees are getting tested regularly. So I know we've got a lot of full-time workers who might not be able to have the time to go and get tested all the time, but definitely making sure that that time is available for your workers to make sure that they can get tested on every 2 weeks or something. And finally, that concludes our lightning round segment. Thank you for listening to PovPolPodcast. I've been your host, Nigel Kirk. If you enjoy what you've heard, please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a positive rating on your listening service. Also, please consider supporting me and supporting the project on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/PovPolPodcast. If you have topics you'd like to hear about or lightning round suggestions, please email them to povpolpodcast@gmail.com. The music used for the podcast is Poor Boy by Pedro Santiago and is under a Creative Commons license.